We're happy to introduce Yesol Park today. She's currently a PhD candidate and lecturer at Tree in cognitive science group. So she's a cognitive scientist, but she was trained as a landscape architect in UK and the Netherlands and in Korea. As I briefly mentioned, that she worked as an intern in my office like 10 years ago, but then now I'm so proud that she's going to talk about something I don't really know about. So let's see how much she grew out of parking for the last 10 years. I think today's topic, so as I said, until last week, we had 3 guest speakers who are not really related to design professionals. So since you never know where inspiration will come from, when and from whom. So I think all those 3 talks were quite intriguing, at least to me. But then I think starting from Yesol's talk, we're more approaching closely to more directly related to our profession. So today, Yesol, I think because even though she's now in the cognitive science field, and then her the dissertation topic is architect's spontaneous hand gesture indicates information not explicitly shown in an external design medium. So I think she's looking for some synthetic way of represent certain mode of conception or design thinking, so that on top of kind of normative way of representation. So I think that's also what we are looking for from this seminar, that how section can do something that other normative way of presentation cannot, right? So I'm really looking forward to listening to her talk today. So thank you.
First of all, thank you for Jung to invite me to such a great topic.
I think you can sit.
Yeah, actually I prefer. Yeah, I'm really glad that I can contribute such an interesting topic of section, particularly from the perspective of landscape architecture. As she mentioned before, at the moment I'm doing my PhD research at cognitive science group at ETH. But my original background is in landscape architecture, both for bachelor and master degree, and I also worked as landscape architect in various types of companies, like Arup. Have you guys know? Yeah, Arup in London, and also I also worked in small size studio as well in like Europe, UK, Netherlands and Korea as well. So I think I cannot really run away from my original background. I mean, like even though like I'm doing my research at cognitive science group, I'm still looking for the topic of design thinking, and there are a lot of different various type of design, but I really realized that my base is always from landscape architecture. For the reason why I'm doing my research at cognitive science group is, as a designer or as a landscape architecture student, I always thought landscape design is not easy, very difficult, and I always ask why is that. And I found some reason, I defined myself 2 different reasons, and based on some literature reviews, because landscape architecture is simply about creative design thinking, which is really one of high level intellectual activity that human being can conduct. So design itself is very difficult, but also on the other hand, designer has to consider about space, like complex spatial environment, and particularly landscape architecture is about often it's about larger scale space. So it's very complex, and landscape designers always has to deal with these 2 different very difficult things simultaneously. So I wonder, like, how can I study a landscape architect's mind while they are doing their, like, conducting their design problem solving. That's why I start my PhD at Cognitive Science Group. I'm not sure how much of you are familiar to cognitive science, but I can briefly explain what it is. Cognitive science is basically the science of mind, so how human think, or like this. This is quite young disciplines. It just like popularized since 1950 because of development of computer as well, like AI, and so they really try to make they really try to model how the thinking process of human, and therefore they have to know about the patterns, how people think. And particularly I want to learn about designers' brain, but like compared to any other normal types of human thinking, design is even more difficult because we cannot scan humans' brain. Like you cannot put designers in the fMRI device while they are designing things. So we don't use like a normal device which neuroscience takes, like EEG, some brain scanning. We cannot do that, but still cognitive scientists trying to approach to study about designers' brain by observing their behavior. So it's more close to behavior science as well, and it's purely empirical discipline. So we run a lot of experiments with designers. So we put designers in the lab and we try to find objective conclusion based on the statistical finding based on the experiments. So like from behavior perspective, I found the most interesting part of designers' behavior is we always use external representation and we have to always interact with them, and different types of representation is employed to solve certain design problem, and yeah, therefore it's important to understand representation correctly. So I'm looking at drawing as not just simple expression of space, but I'm looking at drawing as the language of designers, and I'm looking at how they are interact with drawings and how it's trigger or even limits designers' thinkings. And on the other hand, the other important factor that I found that from designers' behavior is we somehow always use our hands a lot. Like architects or landscape architects, even though they have this kind of representation material as communications like medium, they still add a lot of gesture while they are explaining their design. But hand gesture is not only for communication, because it's also involved in your thinking part as well. And even some scholars argue that hand gesture is actually simply only for yourself, for your cognition and your thinking part. Because a funny example is like some blind people still produce gesture while they are talking on the phone. So it means and also like we also do that. So it doesn't mean that we produce gesture to show to the other people. It's but more spontaneous your reaction while you are thinking. And also, even though we have a lot of digital software which support our design activity like 2D CAD, 3D CAD or digital CAD, many people still prefer to use their hands especially for conceptual parts. And so many scholars looking at how and why using hand is important for creative thinking, and like many research labs are developing some gesture-based device for urban design or landscape design. But still, I'd say current technology is not gesture-based technology. It's not really supporting designers' cognition, but it's more about controlling interface. So I really want to know what is the role of gesture, especially while designers are interacting with external medium. So I conducted like very exploratory observation from the beginning. So I had like a 30-minute interview with architects, and I gave them simple like abstract plan drawing, and I asked them their interpretation of this building. This was hospital building in Berlin, and I asked them how they think about this building, and I didn't mention any thing about gesture, but as you can see from the video, they use a lot of their hand gesture, and my like impression from this video was they are adding information which is not expressed by which is not visually presented in the medium.
So it's the hands, the hand of the architect who designed the building?
So actually, I wanted to use the like voice, but I cannot. So I can explain what this architect's explaining about. So this architect thinks the entrance of the building is not really well designed. So he like adds like movement circulation more like preferably, or which, and then what structure should be manipulated, and something, that kind of topic was discussed. So like my argumentation is each kind of representation has certain purpose for depending on what designer want to do it. Therefore, a representation material never cannot be neutral tools, because it has certain purpose, and if they bring some different purpose with this to this representation material, if it's a material is not optimal for the task, simply the representation will have a lot of limitation. So I believe, like as designer, understanding about real purpose of representation and characteristic is very important to use it properly. But like from my experience, I didn't really think about what is plan or what is sections and why I need to use it or when I need to use it. Like I realized understanding about purpose of representation is important since I started my PhD. So I can share today what I learned while I'm conducting my PhD study. So as I said before, I had like impression that gesture can complement the limitation in architecture representations, and I would argue that if we can really find a way how to interpret the hand gesture properly, we even could understand what kind of thinking is ongoing on designer's brain. So I would say the way of representation will influence the way designers think, and this will be reflected by their hand gesturing behavior. So I wanted to find the patterns of their hands use while they are interacting with certain types of medium. So I'd say I have 3 keywords for my research, and I would put section on the architectural representation part. And hand gesture, as I said before, important role of hand gesture for me is thinking part. And today I will have 3 parts of talk, and this kind of question will lead my talk of today. And first of all, as I briefly explained before, my interest in how can we know characteristic of representations, and I will explain how I run experiments with hand gesture to understand about the characteristic of representations. So as we all know, like there are different design process, and depending on the designing process, you have to position your medium depending on your process. And the interesting part for me is more in the early conceptual design part, because it's difficult, and I think major job of designer is always about developing concept and this early stage design part. And I wonder how section can be like placed in this early stage. First of all, to know about hand gestures, role of hand gesture, I have to know about what kind of design thinking is ongoing on designer, and I wanted to know if there is correlation between design topic and patterns of hand movement. And I would say there are two types of important design topic aspects, which first is form and the other part is functions. So architects and landscape architects always all about creating form actually, but more importantly we have to think about what is the consequence after our designing or function part. So we have to always think these two different types of aspects of design simultaneously. But I'd say the current like medium only visually shows the structure part. So when architects consider about structure, for them it's more easy because structure aspect is visually presented here, even though it's abstract. But if you want to discuss about the function, it's still limited, it's even more abstract, so it requires more cognitive load of designers. So they takes more times and they have to think more like deeply to think about function based on the visually presented visually presented information in plan or sections. So this I used the same interview material which I showed you before, and the first stage that I did was transforming this raw video material to the graphic transcript. This is the graphic transcript that I use for my gesture study. So there are two parts of the transcript. The upper part is showing the plan that I use, and the below is the speech protocols, and it's following the timeline here, and there is the mark for gesture and how it's matching each other depending on the time sequence. So, and I had to have two different steps we call it as coding, and to find the patterns or modeling of the hands movement. We call it as a coding, and I had to have two separate steps of coding schemes. First, I wanted to know what kind of design topic is focused by architects or designer. And second step, I wanted to match how the patterns of hand movement is matching to the one of design topic, either structure or functions. So this is diagram how I make the structure of two different steps. And I wanted to count how many gestures occur depending on the aspect of two different function or structure topic. So this is examples of how I did. So this, and in this video I will try. So in this case it was the case that architects mentioning about the structure thinking. So it's the designer explained about how the layout of the building looks like, and how the overhang is located. And when I looked at the trace of gesture, the gesture really followed the lines which like already presented in the medium. So, on the other hand, this case was like I defined as a functional part, and in this case, architects mentioned about lighting quality of the building, and the architect has to produce his hand gesture to like explain what is the direction of the sun comes from. So he made like this, we call it as an iconic gesture to show the representation of the sun movement. So he moved his hands like from here to here, and then he explained because sun comes from here to here, this part is more bright and the other part is more shady, something like that. So when I traced the hand gesture, I found that the patterns of movement is not necessarily following the medium, lines in the medium. And I like run some statistical analysis, and I could conclude that when architects focus on functional topic, the information wasn't like inherent in the medium. Therefore, they had to more information by iconic gestures. But on the other case, when they talked about structure aspects, they simply used this pointing gesture to highlight the visually presented information in the medium. While I'm looking at this kind of result, and also my result from my observation, I could learn that plan doesn't have verticality on the medium. So for example, when they explain about the different level or structure of the building, it doesn't show the verticality of the building, so they have to create like vertical gesture like this. So I realized, plan doesn't have vertical aspects, and therefore architects had to add gesturing for discussing that part which is missing in the plan. So this was my first experiment, and I want to compare how it's different for section next time. Unfortunately, I'm still at the stage of developing experiments, so I cannot tell you like directly the findings, but I can like ask you what could be your assumption compared to this case with plan. How will be different? Like what could be different of sections, and how can we know the characteristic of purpose of sections? So still I'm developing my experiments, but based on literature review, I looked at the difference between plans and sections. Plan can show you the overall layout of the site, but section is more about relation between other aspects of the space. So I'd say section could have more functional aspect than plans, and it's about process. But still, I'm sure there will be inherent information in sections. And the other assumption for my section, inherent information in section, will be discussed in my second part of experiments. So the other study that I conducted with hand gesture was spatial ability for architects, because spatial ability is the core ability for like landscape architects or architecture disciplines, designers. because always have to deal with space, and they have to understand, or they have to have real advanced ability to understand three-dimensional spatial environment. And like at TH architecture group, they invited some psychologists, and together with architecture professor, they spent some time to develop this kind of spatial ability test to test the ability of students. So this is like kind of similar task that you are taking for your IQ test, for mental rotations, but they picked up particular thinking types, particularly important for architects and designers. So they picked some they developed some several types of tests, and like for example perspective taking as a test, and one was like a packing test with three-dimensional components and objects, and one of them was this one, mental coding test, and this was the one for asking students about sectional thinking. So basically to say, you have the cube with line, and the test asks you cut through the object with line, and what is the sectional surface after you cut. And I wanted to know if gesture actually can help for this kind of thinking, and if I allow students to use their hand gesture, if their ability to find the right answer is more easy or not. So that was my question. So I used also different types of tests to compare the role of gestures, and the other one was called verbal transformation test. So this one, for example, you have cube on the top, and there is a written instruction. You have to follow the steps, and you have to mentally transform this cube, like rotating, extruding, and you have to find the final answer after following all this mental process, imagination and process. But like kind of depressing result was gesture. What I found from my experiment was gesture not always work for all kind of spatial thinking. Like the interesting finding was students produce a lot of gesture only for verbal transformation tests, but not for mental coding tests. And I looked at why is that, because this different types of thinking has different types of spatial ability, require different types of spatial ability, and for a sectional coding test, it's only require your visual imagery. So you cut and you visually imagine what is the cutting after the section after cutting. But the other one require more complex activity, like motor image, which called motor imagery. And I looked at other gesture study in behavior science discipline, because like gesture with design discipline is still new field, so not much study has been done. But like in more educational discipline, they run a lot of study if gesture helps for your understanding for mathematics or science, and they always argue that gesture effectively work for motor related thinking. But then my question is actually, because when we look at section drawing, we don't do much for this kind of coding thing, right? Because maybe after to draw the section, we need this kind of spatial ability as well. But let's go back to the section drawing that I had before. But to understand the section, or if it helps your imagination beyond the line, it's still a lot of different abilities involved. And before I say the characteristic of section that I found from literature was section is about processing and the relation between others. So process means still I see that motor related thinking, even though the presentation shows the relation between each other's spatial elements, it's visually inherent. You have to interpret yourself what is meaningful for you and what is relate to each other, and from that part, and like what is, for example, here, how is the construction involved each other, and what is the process for here, like water or city. So still when we look at section, motor relation thinking is involved. So I'd like to run some experiments how like designers move their hands for motor related thinking while they are dealing with section drawing. And this part, I'd like to introduce about the influence of new technologies. Because before, it was big job of our designers to draw or draw by themselves about a certain space. This is like the image that that you can find if you Google like before CAD, like the life designers before CAD, and you can find a lot of similar, even crazy picture as like this, and like I cannot imagine how I could kind of like even improve my design if I have to spend a lot of time to just draw off the side, right? So I think the profession of our like designer as a profession influence like hugely depending on the technology, I'd say. So simply like depicting or expressing space is not about our concern anymore, because for example, I heard you will have point cloud lecture coming other week, but I can explain briefly some technology that are discussed for landscape architecture and how it can change our attitude or manner for dealing with our design solving problem. And one of technology that I think it's very fascinating or effective for landscape architecture is point cloud modeling. And like ETH landscape architecture group really hugely use this technology, even because I involved some design studio in ETH landscape architecture, and my impression from their like direction is always they really try to make students only like using point cloud model. So they don't offer 2D sections or plans for their designing part, but they really want to only use digital software for whole entire for their designing process, because the group believe it's enough and it's more effective. So this is the scanner, laser scanner called Faro, and if you use this Faro in the open space, this scanner can simply scan entire place, and you will have this kind of beautiful, even with color difference models by yourself. And the only job that you need to do is you cut or you select the parts that you need for your design. So even you don't have to spend your time to draw a section that you need, but just the point scanner gives you all the information that you need. So even it shows the height level, so it's all about information that particularly what you need. You can choose the perspective that you want, and you can cut through the software called Point Cloud. So no longer you don't it's not important for you anymore for drawing sections, existing sections. And the other technology that I would like to introduce is augmented technology. Maybe I'm sure some of you heard about this technology. This is like based on real environment. You can add more visual informations while you are wearing the glasses. This kind of Microsoft HoloLens, and many architects or designers are talking about using augmented technology during their designing process, because we have a lot of information layer, different layers, and designer always has to be flexible to switch different informations layer. And this technology is very effective in that sense, because you can choose and switch. And so even, for example, I can show you my friend's work. It was kind of like simple example that show that you don't need any more even computer or printed material to show your buildings, because you can simply wear the glasses and you can bring your model in any space. And this was one of work that my friends at ETH did from Building Information Science Group. So when you wear the glasses, it shows what is ongoing on the building. Like it's augmented more information based on the real building environment. So you can understand what is going on in the building in physically. Even though this example show only the inside of the building, but this group is also looking at how they use augmented reality for open space as well, like a city scale. And if it's really more improved, I imagine that you could see construction detail of canals or pipe in landscape, and especially if you can set the section in the visual device. So it will be even more effective for having a specific section information for your certain purpose. And the other technology that I briefly showed before is tangible user interface, called tangible user interface. So including MIT Media Lab, City Science Group, and also ETH Landscape Architecture Group, they all talked about hands use is helping your creative thinking and understanding of topology of the site. It's more effective and promote your creative thinking. So they are trying to develop this technology as well. So as you see, from my understanding, the future of representation of space will be really different compared to before and even present. So, and it's more about information, dealing with information, because our landscape will be even more complex than before and dynamic as well. So it's not about, I think, landscape architecture will ask you more and more about how designers can be experimental or flexible to choose right information for them for their certain types of design, like schemes or strategies. But on the other hand, I still would like to ask if it means we don't need like classical 2D dimensional static images sections, we don't need it anymore, or if it still can be the core of design conceptual, core representation of conceptual part, why is important and how can we deal with such a classical representation materials. This is like my question that arises from myself while I'm conducting my research. Thank you.
Can you go back to the last slide? I think Yesol just ended her talk by raising the very big and intriguing questions. So maybe we can have a 5-minute break, and then you can maybe prepare your question and your opinion for that, and then we can all discuss together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
회사에서 디스커션 많이 합니다. 되게 좋은데? 잠깐만, 내가 같이 또 얘기 좀 해. 내가 하고 싶은 질문이 열려 있는데 얘기를 먼저 하고.
Even both of the normative way of representation and design thinking too, and also for all this new technology really improve our design process and also the way of representation. Let me just ask you. Let me start with this question, because to be able to inspect, for example, the inside of the structure that we cannot really see. That is possible, of course, because we have this AR or VR technology. But then to be able to do so, in the end, I think the tremendous amount of information has been already input into the system, right? So I just wonder, is that at the end really the information matters, not the imaginative thinking process or anything like this? I just wonder what is the cognitive science attitude toward that. And also on top of this question, I think it's not that the classical way of representation or thinking process limiting our design process, but then I think sometimes the newly developed technology really limit our design thinking process. For example, like point cloud, I was searching for what is the recent development of point cloud by the ETH, the Christoph Zero chair, but then the latest YouTube was 2014. So it was really up-to-date moment that Christoph Zero came with this point cloud that was already used by engineers, but then he tried to bring this technology to landscape, but not just as a representational tool, but then he was really eager to use it as a design thinking process or design tool. But then I haven't really, frankly, seen any of those innovative involvement of the point cloud into the design process. Either, if I can dare to say that. So I just wonder, what is your how can I say? What is your attitude or approach toward the limitation imposed by this recent technology, in terms of improving our design process?
I agree with your concern, because that's why I put the questions in my last slide like this. Because while I'm conducting the experiments, and I did a lot of interviews actually with architects and designers, like what if the supportive tool that would you like to have for your design process? Because I wanted, my final interest for my research is how can gesture-based technology can really support designers' creative thinking. And I conducted interview with their experience with new technology. And the one other technology that I didn't mention is actually VR, the virtual reality technology. And there was some times that researchers or designers tried to employ VR technology for designing process, but it's really I'd say it's almost failed. Not like it's less discussed than before, because simply VR is only for showing more too perfect image. Like it's more for, I would say it's more finer stage of design, which is more just visualization of your final product. So it's not trigger the conceptual part of your creative thinking. And while I thinking about that issue, I realized having too much perfect or complete images for designer actually not really helping for your developing your thinking, because there is no room for designers to develop more, because it's easy to find maybe the lacking point or problem of the space, but still while you are having too perfect images, you will interrupt by that visual information. So more abstract drawing can also give you more bigger room to think about, more like having your own solutions, or which is not biased by given information.
So is that something? Isn't it where the cognitive science can enter?
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, I'd say.
And
So.
how your future research will conduct that part of the research?
That's why I'm dealing with classical material to know about what is the basis, like basic elements of our thinking for while we are interacting with representations.
Yeah, I think our imagination starts where the lack of information starts, right?
Yeah, sure.
But then I think, well, I'm afraid the Western technology really doesn't make the room that you just talked about to really, for us to start process our imagination process. And I think, as you said, also the hand gesture to supplement the lack of verticality in architecture plan, that also shows where the cognitive science can enter. That imagination starts from the lack of information, but then it goes back to my first question. Then is that so that at the end, really the information matters, and so that's actually what I also wanted to open up to the students for the discussion and question.
But like the insight that I gained during I'm conducting the experiments and research was there, but also it's clear that there is benefit or advantage from new technology as well. So the more important thing is for designer is ability to be flexible, like so it's important for them to know what is meaningful for you and what is like relevant information for you. So they have to really smart, I would say, more like and flexible to choose right information and like trigger your more imaginations based on your given mediums. So you really have to understand what is the right purpose of each mediums. Therefore, then you can really choose right representation for yourself and how you will maximize the benefit from high technologies and for your making your design more stronger. I think that's required ability for future landscape architecture profession. I think that was my insight, I would say.
I wanted to add I thought it was really interesting when site information could be like the devil or the angel. Like, does it hinder your imagination, or do you need that information to catapult your decision making? So I think that's really interesting. But I wanted to ask about one of the reading that was part of for this lecture. I thought it was interesting. There was a part about how language is quite the basis of our conception. And I know your interests are like right now kind of you're trying to organize it based on like now you did the plan experiment, now you might want to do the section, but do you think that language part, like do you see that as part of your research? Because I can imagine that like I know like maybe you have a Korean background, like how that language particularly shapes our thinking, or like the words used in landscape architecture in Korean and how different they are from English. Like, and I see a huge difference also. So
I actually very appreciate that you arise this question, because I kind of afraid if I focus too much cognitive research methods to hear if you are confused or not. But actually, language like protocol study, we call it as a verbal protocol study. It's really common way for psychologists to understand people's thinking. And really, as you say, depending on the language, it's really influenced actually your thinking part. So for example, I work with like German speaking people, and I really understand from their certain cultural expression, I really learned that how they think about, or the way of they think, and I realized the difference between Korean culture way, the thinking way, and German way. And therefore, I think for understanding representation for architects and landscape architects is really core, because it can really imply how they think and how they like culturally, like designing culture, I'd say. It's how it's represented in their activity. So that's why, like, but in normal psychological study, they only look at verbal protocols. But what I learned is if I just look at designers' verbal protocol, it's almost impossible to interpret, because they say a lot about like here, there, this drawing and these images, and I cannot understand only based on their verbal protocols. That's why I looked at video data as well while they are communicating. So I think representation is really core for designing. Even some design science researchers like rationally saying design is all about construction of representation, because for a designer the final product is drawing. We don't like build ourselves for like a building environment, but we deliver drawing as our final conclusion, right? So I think therefore understanding representation is really important for design.
I'm just wondering whether, assuming that the architect you interviewed with had same information about the building, have you tested with different types of basic plan? For example, like you have two types of basic plan of same building, but maybe like slightly different in terms of color or line weights. Then is it possible that they have different gesture even though it's very like basic?
That's also interesting question, because as I show you the building that I use for interview, this one, actually if I ask my proper architect friends, they would say this is more diagram than like plans, right? But I use more detailed version of plan, and I found actually architects less gesture than more abstract plan, because again that one I had even like a construction detail was involved in the plan, and in that case architects did less gesture and but more pointing. And
so does that mean, for example, our studio has the mid-review in 2 days, and if their drawings are not ready, they need to choreograph their gesture rather than finalize their drawings, right? No?
And I think
Say
still
no.
and still you should appreciate their even though it looks like they didn't spend a lot of
Well,
time.
I think it's really interesting question, because we never know what kind of question we have to deal with during the presentation and review and things like that. So I think if you get really bad or strange question, no matter how bad they are, but you somehow need to deal with them. And then I think it's really part of gesture and other more synthetic way of presenting your work is really. I think it's really good weapon for designers.
Yeah,
And
I really agree.
I think it's interesting that you're talking about how hand gestures, like doing this, helps you think or express your thoughts that's coming through. Moving forward with your research, are you going to be looking at like brain activities on like
And gesturing.
yeah, and like so moving forward and looking at people's brain activities when they are gesturing versus maybe tying their hands and not allowing them to gesture, and
So
are you going to look at the differences between how much it
actually
helps?
also I appreciate you address this point, because I was afraid if I took say too much from cognitive science perspective, because
Please go ahead.
this research was actually, I didn't explain maybe like really detailed things. So for this thing, I had like 60 architect students, and I gave them two different conditions. So there was two groups, and one group was asked to, like, I didn't say anything. I just gave them this test material, and I did like a video record, and I just asked them, feel free to interact with paper, and even sometimes like they just spontaneously created gestures. And the other group was actually restricted to not use their hands. So I asked them, can you please hold your hand under the desk and try to solve the test material yourself. And my hypothesis before conducting the experiment was gesture will help for their accuracy and completion time. Like they will be faster to complete the test. But I'm really surprised because actually there was no difference. Like even though they did gesture a lot, like it didn't involve for their like better performance. But even more funny thing is, even though still the statistics says it doesn't like really relevant each other, but I still remember the reaction of my participants. Like when I asked them to not use their hands, hands, they were almost like crying, like screaming, no, like then I cannot do that. So, like even I talked about this with my psychological supervisor, and for psychologists it's super interesting because then why still people prefer to use their hand gesture, even though it's not really help your spatial understanding. So it's like we call it as a embodied cognition. Like we are like our mind is holding in our body, right? So we perceive our space with our physical body together. So when you really want to perceive the space, people like it's spontaneous for people to use their body to really immersive to the space. So they really want to connect their body to the space. Therefore, their movement of body is natural expression of their effort to connect to the space. That's my impression. But this is very difficult area because always design science and cognitive science has to prove that this is more like our impression, but it's difficult to prove by quantitative like a result of the experiment running. So like I want to say, really, I would like to say it's involved in embodied cognition, but my psychological supervisor always say you cannot just say because from your assumption. So, but I would like to continue. If I continue my research after PhD, I really want to know if really there is something about your embodying or understanding space with your body together. So, yeah, but that's difficult one, I think, to prove. Yes.
I'm really curious about we will consider like the culture or education background will impact the result of the gesture, because from the from the videos that shows designers to use gesture to simulate the song. I can imagine actually he is completing a kind of a diagram in his mind, which is involving this song moving. But that is something we learn from the school. So if some guys don't have this kind of education, maybe he will use different kind of gesture, and that may kind of impact the final, the way they use their gesture. So will you consider this kind of the impact?
Actually, I run also some experiments with non-architects as well, but I think I'd say they still create gesture, even though they don't have background in architecture. But it was quite similar the way with how architects do it. But only like other fact that I found is they don't know about much design, so they more creating gesture from like a novice part, but still I would say it wasn't that much different. So I also, that was surprising outcomes, because always architecture, maybe it's really like a specialized disciplines, but still perceiving the space based on the drawing, even though you don't have proper education, I'd say their gesture is more like a pure way or radical way, but still it's about spontaneous gesture. So that's why some people sometimes confused with sign language and gesture, because sign language is kind of standardizes permission about like more it's a language which like learned by, but spontaneous gesture is really from your natural like movement. But yeah, that's why it's also difficult, because as you say, also it can be diagrammatic based on his background, right? So some people argue gesture is about communication, and some people argue it's about thinking. But from my perspective, it's really difficult to detach each other. It's somehow involved together, because also while, as you say before, like while we are having conversation with other people, we still think. It's promote your thinking. And especially for designer, it's very common that we have idea over design meeting, right? So design meeting is about communication, but also it's about your developing ideas. So it's really, I think sometimes I don't feel like if it's really meaningful to detach communicative or cognitive role of gesture or not. So there is a debate in between.
I guess sort of in regards to your questions that you posed at the end, it's like a lot of this stuff, the analysis you did speaks of like gesturing and like trying to like register this gesture and like that communication and the cognitive thought that goes into that. And it's like, it seems to me that like just in like a representational mode, that like actually like having some sort of abstract two-dimensional drawing allows one to like document their thought process in communication, because like in point cloud modeling, it's quite challenging, because typically they represent like a static image. They may be dynamic in the way that you can interact with them, but they represent like a survey.
You mean point cloud?
Yeah, point clouds, or like VR, where they represent like a very specific 3D model, and they don't speak to like the dynamics of like atmosphere or like a changing atmosphere. It's typically just like a prescribed situation.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's like, I mean, I guess like this sort of the sand modeling is something that allows.
So you feel like sand modeling could be different compared to the other technology in sense of.
It seems like with point cloud or with sort of like VR immersion experiences, typically a lot of the technology is put into more like marketing or like engineering examples. So it's hard for that to use. Like, it seems harder for both the computer and for the user to use it as a tool to like increase their like design dialogue.
So it's more like aggregate of a lot of information.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, they may be able to like make it have like some shade studies, but it's very like hard to like manipulate it.
Sure.
Very, like, fluid.
Yeah, I agree, because like I also.
So what's happening in the ETH landscape group now? We can turn off the camera.
Yeah. Yes, please.
No, like, as I said, I mean, seriously, I was really interested in point cloud, so I was really Googling what the Christopher Zero is doing now, but then I couldn't really find any. Maybe they're kept a secret, but I don't know. So do you see?
Okay.
Did you participate in any of their review or anything like that? And how they use the point cloud?
So as I said, they really try to. Can I turn off? No. They really try to use point cloud as or the basis of your like representation of your design. So, but my impression was like ETH is technical university, and I would say they have really a lot of fascinating technology, new technology for architecture, and one of them was like robots. They talk a lot of robotic architecture, robotic landscape, and how we can use robots for like our design. But the thing is, it's clear that robot is really helpful for fabrication, like constructions of building, but it's not really about cognition. So what I found from observation is developing technology is relatively easier than understanding cognitions. So like developing technology, pure technology, a lot faster. So we have a lot of technology available technologies, but we first have invented technology, and after that people try to find the reason or why we need this technology. So people try to, I'd say ETH landscape architecture is very experimental. They even don't know why they want to use robot, but they drop the robot to student and ask them if you can find the right purpose for your design. I'd say it's very interesting, but on the other hand, yeah, it's kind of also risky, I'd say, because then during this design studio, students wouldn't learn so much about landscape architecture design, the core of it, but they spend time for finding the reason why I need this technology. So it's somehow, I wouldn't say which one is worse or better, but it's, yeah, again, that's why I'm saying for future designer, it's a flexibility and smart thinking is important to deal with given available technologies.
Have you conduct any experiment, or have you encountered any research result from other scholars that to see, for example, kind of comparing two different design process? For example, like if you're designing landform, starting with your doodling by hand or starting with Rhino, I mean, which design process really help you better understand the landform design process, for example? So have you encountered any of those research?
I didn't conduct, but I'm not sure if this example is directly relevant what you want to like ask, but there was interesting experiments conducted by other cognitive science group. Was they make architects actually blindfolded. So for beginner designer it wasn't possible, but advanced, the best design was from when architect was blindfolded. So also that's kind of questioning why we really need representation, and that also I think that tells something. It's still for me it's vague, and abstract to link to actually, because I also thought about the design experimental setting that you say to compare the different medium, but I think that's already implies something. We cannot just fixed assumption before trying the experiment. So I think your suggestion could be very interesting, and it's more direct to see the characteristic of different medium.
So thank you for interesting presentation and talk. And I think the idea that architecture is never 2D, but we draw sections and plan to represent that 3D environment into two-dimensional drawing, and then I think somehow when we involve hand gesturing, when we explain that to drawing that represents 3D environment, comes from kind of those frustration, and then kind of that split between the different dimension. And also, as you mentioned, with the development of AR and VR, and then a new way to represent 3-dimensional is emerging. Do you think that you briefly mentioned that the hand gesture can be a kind of a new technology. And then do you see that as like a new way that like human involvement can be still valued in this era where like technology is kind of dominating the field of design?
Like, if I correctly understand your question, so like how designer can it's still important for designers' role for developing idea. Is that right?
Yeah. So that's like one part, and then like what do you see your hand gesture technology could be evolved into?
That's very like still I have difficulty to application part of like gesture based technology development, because that was actually my first motivation to start my PhD with hand gesture topic. But then, as I said before, like it's really difficult to finding patterns of hand gesture from like because hand gesture is about spontaneous your expression. It's difficult to standardization because there is individual different tool for gesturing. Even sometimes you gesture, but you don't know why you did this gesture, and it's also always different. But still, if we develop gesture-based technology, it has to start from cognitions. So, for example, like let's say to help your rotation, like some people do this and some people do like this, but we need some standardization to make computer understand your way of gesturing. So there you need standardization, but you cannot just give random thing as a sign language. Like sign language even involved in some like reason why people do use certain gestures. So I think to really develop the technology for design thinking, therefore it's important for like cognition part, like what is the dominant, at least the most dominant hand gesture for certain role of design thinking, something like that. Is it answering your question or? Okay.
Do you have a specific reason why you choose the plan drawing for the cognitive gesture research? Well, I agree with that the section drawing contains more like functions aspect, but sometimes it's hard to distinguish the drawing is whether plan drawing or section drawing abstract.
Also, like before I did my PhD, I realized I didn't know really right purpose of each medium, and I thought actually in the beginning I thought section is more involved for construction parts, or it's more can be manipulated by designers' schemes. It can be strategic to show their intention of the process of their landscape or their design scheme. But plan, I thought it's more about, it's like you can start, I more thought plan is more starting point for designers to deal with certain space, and that was my impression. But yeah, later on, that's why I put the design process diagram, and my question was where you will position your section in this designing process in conceptual idea development part, because even as you say, I realize section can be really comes from the beginning part as well, together with plan, or even before the plan, maybe if it's really fit on your purpose. So yeah, I wouldn't say section is construction part or more detailed part than plans, I'd say.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have any aspirations for where this research is going beyond, like maybe developing the gestural technologies, like maybe like in pedagogy or like design teaching.
That's also like somehow I always thought I hoped my research could contribute to certain aspect of designer. Like I wanted to really support them based on my research findings, but like while I'm experiencing from having the unexpected result from running experiment, for example, hand gesture wasn't really relevant for your spatial ability, then I become really depressed because it didn't go. Then it means we don't need gesture-based like technology for like if I just following my research, right? But then I learned that from the difference between design and science is even still science appreciate or value of the unexpected finding. Even they, sometimes some researcher or scientists like be excited by unexpected finding, because based on that surprising result, you can come up with more a really different thing than before. So I'd like to still, maybe I still have a design background and I want to have more like an effective outcome or beneficial outcome for a certain thing. So I always still, my attitude while I'm running experiments, I want to have I want to support my hypothesis like successfully. But if it goes well, I could contribute some technological or educational support for designers. But even though sometimes it's not like then I think it could be the process of we found the right technology for designers' cognition. I think that I could contribute in that direction, I think. So I'm trying to find more. Yes.
I have a question. Do you think you'll have to adapt some of this research as time moves forward? Thinking about some of the slides you showed about when technology was more analog prior to CAD, and how individuals might learn and interpret data, I assume has drastically varied from pre-computer to now when we're using some of these more interesting technologies, and I assume even 10 years from now, more reliance on technology will be taught in school. And I'm just wondering, does that have an effect on like some of these more social like coordination and gestural type stuff? Does that make sense? Or?
Can you elaborate a little bit more? Like, so you are interested in?
I'm wondering, like, from your research, how you're measuring people and how they react to the different drawings, the plan, for example, and I assume that has changed over time or would change over time based on the current technologies available. And are you thinking about that in the future as technologies continue to shift? Will these like more gestural notions that people have, are they intrinsically tied to individuals, or is it more parallel to like the technologies available?
Yeah, like one of my thoughts for experimental design was actually, what if I'm not giving like them plans for the experiment, like the interview, but I'm giving different types of materials, like mediums, representations, and let architects choose to one of representation which fit on their purpose, something like that. So from that idea, I wanted to know how is like their behavior or their like intention for designing, and how they spontaneously react on the medium for their purpose. So I think from that idea, I wanted to know if really gesture can directly, like whether gesture is really something for design or not, because even though I'm starting with hand gesture from the impression that hands is something for designer, maybe my impression or like assumption could be completely wrong. So I still see the room for other type of supportive some fact for designer. So like if I really see my research direction for long term, maybe I will also have some other facts of like designers which can help for design thinking or supportive way. And yeah, that's I'm not necessarily gesture has to be something for like designer, but maybe there will be something else. Yeah, so I'm kind of flexible. Is that answering your question?
Yeah.
I have a question for both of you, especially Professor Kim.
Me?
Yeah. You talked about the potential and limitations of advanced technology in design and how it might be limiting imagination because it's giving more information. And how do you conjecture the future when people will consider these kind of technologies default? And how do you mentioned last week that you started with the hand sketch, and the second year everyone, or like more than half of the students were CADing their drawings.
Right, between 1999 and 2000.
Yeah, and these days we consider CAD as default.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Hand sketch
It's your
is
hand.
more like preliminary to arts CAD drawing, and I assume that maybe like in 5 years or 10 years, like Queen Club may be the default design tool for everyone. And do you see the difference between your generation and your students or your employees, and what do you think will be like in like 5-10 years when the technology is different? Because when I came to GSD, there was only like limited amount of 3D printers, but now like everyone's 3D printing, and this is the new norm. And I already see like, I don't exactly know what is the difference, but I see the differences around school. So do you see any, and what do you think it would be like?
Well, that question really made me feel I'm really old now. But yeah, I think, I mean, for example, I was teaching the landscape first year course studio last semester. But because it's their first semester, they really don't know how to use all this technology, right? So they're the one, I think, but as time goes, like their reliance on the technology really much improved when at the end of the semester compared to the beginning of the semester. So, but I still believe that the cognitive part of the design process really relate to hand sketches and doodling process. So that because it's really easy to have better outcome by with a computer-based technology than by hand sketches. So if you keep looking at your ugly hand sketches, you just have to keep thinking and then keep doing it again. But then the production that you can get from the computer-based tools, I think sometimes it give you better results too soon. So I think that's what I believe, that the lack of imagination and then more chance to develop your design kind of happens. So for example, like my studio now developing kind of more synthetic way of presenting their work, the design by inspired by the 1900 panorama drawing by a Russian painter. So although all the scales and interpretation are different by teams, but then I think that's kind of the approach that I want to use in the studio, that what is another way of showing or developing your idea on top of the normative way of presentation. But then I think it goes back to the question of is technology really helping our imagination or limiting our imagination, and what is the role of our brain in that? I mean, I mean that certainly the development of technology really depending on the role of brain for of the engineer and scientist, but I think it's not really true for the brain of designers. So I think that's why your talk today was really intriguing and interesting.
Maybe I can add some
Sure, yeah.
bit more point because I don't want to insert our older generation designers at all because they had a different time for like with given technology, available technology in that time.
Right.
But I think even
Like fax, fax and blueprint.
yeah, but like simply if we try to think about the advantages of high technology, I think it's not like directly visible what technology change how the way of your designing or what, like, but for example, as you give the example of 3D printers, if our later students generation is more open to certain 3D printer as their toy, I think it's somehow changing their approach or manner for approach it to the design solving problem, I think, because sometimes when I'm talking to more like a really older generation designer professor, for young students certain design problem is super easy because if the student understand the new technology, given the characteristic of new technology, even though that technology is not directly developed for design part, he think or she or think from their experience with that kind of their familiar technology as they played before. So I think it influenced their approach to design solving problem. So maybe it's not like directly visible, but I still think it can influence for future way of designing activity, I think.
Great. Any other question?
Maybe
Oh,
I have
one more.
quick
Yes.
question. So based on your research, what you were showing, I had like a similar precedent study done before, which is like this one. It's called Intuitive and Effective Gestures for Conceptual Architectural Design.
Yes.
So basically what they do is like based on the hand gestures, they create a kind of taxonomy, like if this gesture is supposed to be a square and this gesture is supposed to be a circle. And based on that, they do the conceptual drawings for architecture. So like just you being an expert in this field, I want to know like how effective would this technology be in the future? I'm not sure if you're aware of like this project, but that was like kind of my research last semester. And then I was trying to study like how this gestural approach would be converted into a software interface for conceptual designs for architects. So
like really I can share the images. So the tangible user interface is kind of really hot topic for design researchers because they conducted a lot of experiments. If designer become more free with so we use keyboard and mouse, for example, for our designing process, like still, right? And there was some comparable experiments if designers are more creative when their body and hands are free compared to they have to always hold their hands with mouse while they are thinking about creative thinking. And always the result was like a significantly different, like they were more creative while they are using hands more with the free conditions. So I would say that direction from that from that finding, gesture based interface or technology will help for their creative process. But as you say, still gesture always has to be standardized to communicate with computer. But like that's some scholars argue that maybe we don't need gesture communication with computer, but I still think it's important for let designers feel free to move their body, I think. So that's tricky part. Like still I cannot come up with direct like idea for how gesture-based interface or technology should go ahead, so which direction for in terms of supporting architects. But it's sure that when architects are more free to use their body, they are more like feel comfortable at least, or like have more creative idea for their design. I think that's my impression or assumption.
Great. I think we really need to conclude at this point because we have the presentation by student as well. But then thank you very much for your talk. And you told me that you have 1 year to go before you're the getting the degree, right?
Yeah.
So good luck with your dissertation, and I really want to see your final dissertation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can stay here for the presentation.
Yeah,
And you
I-
can make questions. Shall we just